First of all, Bill, thank you for your time today. It's really a pleasure to have you here with us and hear your perspectives on the future of apparel and footwear supply chains. Before we start, do you mind taking a minute to introduce yourself to the audience and share a little bit about your background and what you do?
Yeah, so Bill McRaith, I've been in supply chain for 40 years of my career, 30 years of that around the world. First half of my career, I was a manufacturer building supply chains around the world. And then the second half of my career, I was leading supply chains for large retailers, senior vice president at Walmart, executive vice president at Victoria's Secret Stores, and chief supply chain officer with a number of companies. My last position with Calvin Klein and Tommy Hilfiger as their chief supply chain officer. Somewhat semi-retired, I would say at this point, but with a huge focus now on how do we really take our industry to a better place. And I think we've had an amazing run for 30 years. I think there's an amazing run ahead of us for the next 20 years, but it's not the same as the last 30 years. And that's where I focus all my time and attention today.
Over the last few years, we've seen a lot of talk and activity around disruption in the apparel and footwear supply chains, from new entrants to sustainability. I would love to hear your perspective on all these moving pieces in our current industry and which ones do you think are most relevant for us?
Yeah, so I guess I would start at the high level and say, I agree, there's a lot of disruption. And I probably, in my whole career, have only seen disruption of this level once, and that was when stuff started to move offshore. And it was a huge change in how we operated. And it can be overwhelming, I think, for some people just now. I tried to bucket things into how I see them. So I'd say just now, you mentioned you've got new kids, what I call new kids on the block, these new ultra fast fashion retailers who have figured out, really prior to the pandemic, but through the pandemic, the consumer changed their behavior. We've moved from a world where I think brands and retailers told the consumer what they would purchase. I think the consumer is now telling us what they are prepared to purchase, them being influenced by social media, by influencers at the product level. I think marketing still drives the brand, but I think that whole thing has changed. And so they need to be more responsive. I think core product and what you'd think of as wear to work has really drifted away as we've moved away from work, and what we wear at work is more fashionable than it used to be. So there's a lot more fashion content in our product. You've got that going on. You've got what I call deglobalization, right? We've got trade issues around the world. We've got Brexit happened. In 2018, we put tariffs, 25% tariffs on Chinese goods into the US. And depending on how the US elections go, we potentially face significantly higher ones of those at some point in the future. So you've got retailers who are kind of faced with the challenge of deglobalization. And yet when you look at where the growth of our industry will come from, if you say apparel and footwear is roughly $2 trillion today, well, the next $5 trillion will not come out of the Americas or Europe. It will come out of the rest of the world, right? So growing to $7 trillion of business, but not where the current big scale is. And so retailers have to think about how to operate in that new environment. And then the last thing is legislation around sustainability, waste, what we do with that waste, holding people responsible for their apparel longer. So you've got kind of all these dynamics coming together. And on one side, you could say it's almost a perfect storm for the industry. But look, one of the things I've learned is the perfect storm creates the perfect opportunity for people to go really take advantage of it. And if you can play the game or win the game better than anybody else, then it's all for you to take. And so on one side, you could say it's overwhelming. On the other side, quite frankly, I wish I was 25 years old again and was in play, because I'd love to take on this one. It's a good one.
Those are actually all great points, and we'll definitely touch now on how to balance the solution to address all those different moving parts in our industry. But I want to double click before in one key topic that I think is on everyone's mind, that is sustainability. We have major commitments for all the big players, and still there is a struggle to kind of address fundamentally the impact and the footprint of our industry. And I would love to understand your perspective on what's driving that today.
So I would say our industry has always been challenged with the amount of waste that it creates, right? It's a fashion industry, it's apparel industry. We're not producing cars. Generally, the life of the product is short. It's disposed of typically to landfill or to some charitable donation. That's been the history of it. But ultimately, all of that has ended up somewhere in landfill. More recently, there are a lot of commitments out there to address it. There's a lot of great people, both inside brands and outside of brands, who I think are working extremely hard to address these things. But given that we've got an industry that's $2 trillion today, growing to $7 trillion, we are actually falling behind on our commitments in the aggregate. We're falling behind addressing the amount of waste that we create. I think the challenge that you've got out there is that a lot of the challenge lives at what's called scope 3 level. So it's outside the space of the brands and the retailers. I would applaud the manufacturers, by the way. I often think they are the heroes that carry most of the lift in addressing this. I would say the biggest challenges are long lead time supply chains that have necessitated us to overorder to never lose the opportunity for a full price sale. That has resulted in large inventories being held in distribution centers, over purchasing. We typically over purchase by about 25%. That's why you hear 75% sell-throughs. If you go back to pre-1990, our sell-throughs were typically in the 90 to 98% sell-throughs because stuff was made locally. And as supply chains extended, that percentage of waste continued to increase on it. What it also did is it lost us the opportunity as well, because more and more, we sold more and more product at low cost. We discounted it and we lost those margins that we could by converting that to full price sale. But the model necessitated it because it was 5 to 6 months from ordering to the consumer telling you if they really liked the product or not. So at the time you bought it, you had no idea if that consumer. So the challenge we've got as an industry is we have a process that's incredibly long. It worked effectively for the last 3 decades, and we created waste, and we don't know how to change that model effectively to address it. At this point, people are struggling to understand how to change the supply chain model, and so continue to operate in exactly the same way. So I think one of the challenges that I think is a flaw as we think of sustainability is that the consumer cares, they don't, right? Just the hard reality is they don't. They want what they want, when they want it, at the price that they want it. And so that's what businesses are focused on. What we have to do with sustainability is transform that to make sustainability profitable for everyone in the process, everyone end to end in the process. Everyone is trying to solve this problem individually. There is little collaboration other than on some light stuff. Solving waste, addressing our sustainability challenges, that will be a collective effort of this industry. And I know there's challenges to that. You have antitrust in the US of companies working too closely together. My own view is when it comes to sustainability, climate change, and waste, it's a place that governments should give us the latitude to collude and conspire against climate change. That's what it will take if we are going to address this.
That's actually a huge point. And I like especially the fact, I think a lot of us rely on consumers being willing to pay more for sustainable products. And I think the fact that they are not driven by that, it's also what is partially holding back this whole process. So I love that point on how do we make the industry model in general, not just supply chains, more profitable and more sustainable, at the same time. And I see your point on collaboration, but what do you foresee as a potential solution to turn around the model through collaboration for us to be able to reduce the waste levels that we actually produce?
So there are two elements to that question. On the front end, we create about 25% system waste. That is where, due to the current supply chains, current planning methodologies, current merchandising philosophies that we've really used for 2 to 3 decades now, we overorder by approximately 25% of goods that the consumer is not willing to pay full price for. And we liquidate those either through discounts, sales, or eventually selling it into some second country to try and liquidate those goods. The solve to that requires a new planning methodology for it, what I call an MDDO. I'll use the term MDDO, multi-dimensional dynamically optimized planning, which is no longer this linear process that we've got out there. So reduce the system waste. The back end is then the stuff that is bought. What do you do with it at end of life? Right? What is the process by which we consume or reuse that product? You see a lot of retailers who are now collecting back the product to resell it, so extend the life. That is a great exercise to do. But still, no one is really addressing at scale the challenge of what do you do with it when it can no longer be consumed, no longer be reused in the market. There's a lot of great technology, and this is where collaboration comes to bear. We've just in the last few weeks seen some pretty major failures in our industry on reasonably scaled recyclers that were out there in certain categories. But even that wasn't big enough. The industry did not get behind them. People were placing small orders with them, or they were doing capsules to say, I have a sustainable capsule that I'm doing. No one had moved core production. And so until the core production goes in, this stuff is just not scalable. You just don't compete with virgin material flows unless you get to these large industry scales. And that's where collaboration has to come to bear. That's where people have to work with each other and align and commit.
And I hear 3 main topics through your explanation. One is loud and clear collaboration across the supply chain. And I think that's definitely a must. But there are 2 other pieces that are indispensable for this to work. One is the appropriate infrastructure to supply those needs, and the technology you were mentioning, MDDO, to actually optimize that process across the different needs. Can you elaborate a little bit more, first on the infrastructure, and then a little bit more on the technology needed to actually drive this solution forward?
Yeah, so just to maybe play on what you just said, I do think it's important as people listen to these, is that these are not, you can't isolate these things into, I'm just going to do one or the other, or they are interlinked with each other. They're interrelated with each other. So to pick up on the point, if I talk about infrastructure first, but then supported by technology. So and it's a piece that I'm working on right now, this idea that what we have worked with today is what I call linear supply chains, right? So it's typically one manufacturer or supplier somewhere in the world, often in Asia or some other country outside the retail market, that is supplying an item on a relatively long lead time into the retail market, whether that be primarily Europe or the US or the Americas, someplace. And so what that long lead time does is I can't react. If I have an upside, I just can't react to that upside. Likewise, if I have a downside, I've got a lot of inventory that used to be cheap to carry, is now very expensive to carry, and ties up huge amounts of my cash. So what we're working on just now is an infrastructure solve to that, which is to say, instead of having a single linear supply chain, what if you have a matrixed supply chain? So effectively, the same item could be produced offshore, low cost, but relatively slow in supply. What if it could also be produced nearshore, higher price, but relatively quickly? And what if I could produce it onshore, as we used to do 30 plus years ago, where, yeah, it is more expensive, but I can respond almost instantly. Not only can I respond instantly, I can test new concepts quickly that I may actually produce offshore once I figured out if the consumer actually likes them. So by having this matrix supply chain that I can now fire off from wherever it is to maximize sales. Again, I think one of the challenges we've had for 30 years, the lever we've pulled is, I want an item at the quality level that I want it at the lowest possible cost. And so I've had the single lever of low cost, but I've carried huge inventories. I've taken massive markdowns. I've liquidated goods significantly that has lost me margin because those dollars were spent on something low cost versus a high margin. If I changed my metrics and KPIs within the business to say, it's no longer about what's called initial markup or driven by cost, you're now metrics on profitability. What is the program profitability? You would actually rethink that space. You'd actually be prepared to pay significantly more for goods that are made close to capture the upsides without taking the inventory risk that I take today. So think of a supplier, whether it's a single supplier or a network of suppliers that can do offshore 80% of your production, nearshore 10% of your production, onshore 5 to 10% of your production. But now you don't take risks. Now you can half the inventories that you've got. Now you can always capture a sale that you could never capture before. That's the infrastructure element. None of that works, quite frankly. Not a dot of that works if you cannot address the tech side of it. Because all the tools that we currently use today were built for a linear supply chain model. We do not have tools today that can continue to recognize rates of sale in a store, translate that through into what have I holding in inventory, what have I got in work in progress, and the next order that I place, should that be nearshore? Should that be onshore, nearshore, or offshore to maintain my perfect position in each of my stores? We do not have planning tools that allow us to look at cost over time through the supply chain and how that variable maximizes my profitability versus today, it's really about maximizing my initial markup, right? And that initial markup is very different to profitability. And look, and just recognize the back challenge on all of this is there are new players out there who are doing this incredibly well, albeit sometimes through using air freight, which is not a good thing to do. But nonetheless, that's the world that we're dealing with. And if the current retailers do not start to step up and see that challenge and change this model, then there will be new players in the future, not the current players. I would say one of the last things is, I think there's always this tendency for us to use purchase orders and throw purchase orders over the wall and wait 5 months for this, 4 or 5 months for it to turn up. And that has been getting shorter, as opposed to just continually flowing the right data to the right point within the supply chain and allowing the supply chain to then make the next best move necessary to ensure the consumer gets exactly what they want and the brand's metrics are all met.
Thank you for that summary. It's very clear what's needed from an infrastructure side and the gaps that exist on the technology side. I wanted to get your take on any trends that you're seeing on the technology side that would enable how to address exactly this type of supply chain and infrastructure capabilities. What would be needed?
You know, from a needs standpoint, what is needed is far more dynamic than what exists today. Again, today, what we've typically used in the industry today is, again, against these long lead times where we're telling the consumer what to purchase. We bundle stuff up. We send it into this long supply chain. So I really only have to plan around what I believe and how I trended last year in that. That is not the world that we are in today. We're in a world today where the consumer's telling us what they want. Trends are moving ever faster. There are people out there, new players on the block that are reacting almost instantaneously to that. So the core, what I'll call the core brands and the core retailers, the vast majority of the industry, they need a new set of planning tools that have that much more dynamic capability on the retail side, but also are able to leverage into the supply chain side as well. And I described the need for this more matrix, dynamic infrastructure on the supply side that can be built. I think today what you see is that there are really two camps, I would say. There are people that are trying to create a slightly better buggy whip, might be my description, when we need a new car, effectively. So we've got that is going on. And then there are certain new players who are out there that I could name, and they come in very many different sizes, who really see the need for this new dynamic world and have really kind of stepped up with this on both the supply, on the demand side of the equation, and be able to grab that information, pull it in more real time, and then transfer it through into how I feed that into a supply chain that, again, is matrixed and multi-layered. Materials, capacities, different retail environments around the world because we're going global. And so it's a very different world. And they're emerging. My only concern is they may not be emerging quickly enough, because I think the brands sometimes, without them changing the cultural aspect of how they operate, even when they find these more advanced capabilities, they try to make them fit the current methodology slightly better, as opposed to let us use it for all that it's worth and bring this new capability to bear. Because again, you'll be dealing with thousands of more decisions that really take it away from people into more autonomous processes that are just firing consistently around the world to make sure we've always got the best stuff in place.
I couldn't agree more, Bill. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a true pleasure, and I really appreciate all your insights.
Great. And thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Every time.
Great.